Here's some advice for you, friend. Don't press your luck. Lay off of me. Don't print that story.
What's that supposed to be? An order?
Listen to me. Print that story, you're a dead man.
It's not just me anymore. You'd have to stop every newspaper in the country now, and you're not big enough for that job. People like you've tried it before. With bullets, prison, censorship. But as long as even one newspaper will print the truth, you're finished.
What's that racket?
That's the press, baby. The press. And there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing.
Welcome to New York, brother. It's a city full of fun. I say, welcome to New York, brother. It's a city full of fun. Yeah. They got plenty of rats and roaches. Enough welfare for everyone. They got a whole lot of police cars with their lights all flashing red.
Well, that's Leon Thomas on the vocals, Johnny Hodges, alto sax, welcoming us to New York, or at least the New York of 1970. And before that, the unmistakable voice of Humphrey Bogart playing the tough guy newspaper editor from the 1952 film classic Deadline USA, telling the racketeer, "There's no way, baby, to stop a free press." My name's Tom Robbins. I've taken that fine movie title for the name of this show, which I call Deadline NYC. The late great Village Voice reporter Jack Newfield used to like to say that real estate is to New York as oil is to Texas. That's where the money is. Wall Street aside in New York, that's still where the money is. And the business of building and renting office and residential towers has made a slew of fortunes in this town. And while, to be sure, there's plenty of honorable people involved in the trade, New York's real estate has definitely hatched a higher than usual number of scoundrels. We think here of Mr. Harry Macklow, who used mob-tied contractors to demolish single-room occupancy hotels in the middle of the night in Times Square. We think here of Donald Trump, who cheated the immigrant laborers who helped clear the way for his flagship building on Fifth Avenue, Trump Tower. So scoundrels aplenty, no question. But a murderer? Well, my friend Charlie Bagley, Charles V. Bagley, as his byline reads, who's covered New York City real estate for the New York Observer, the New York Times for more than 3 decades, Charlie found one. The killer's name is Robert Durst. He comes from one of the wealthiest real estate families in the city, and this month in Los Angeles, Mr. Durst was convicted of killing a woman who was once, I guess, one of his closest friends. His motive, prosecutors said, was to keep her from talking about his alleged murder of his first wife. That poor woman disappeared decades ago and is presumed killed. Oh, and then there was a guy out in Galveston, Texas, who Mr. Durst admitted killing and cutting the guy's body up and tossing it into the Galveston Bay. He beat that rap at trial. He was convicted only of interfering with the evidence by dismembering the body. That's Texas for you. So there was a very popular series called The Jinx a few years ago, made by a master filmmaker, Andrew Jarecki, which bizarrely not only had Mr. Durst's active participation in the making of the series, but which I think ended up playing a fairly key role in his latest trial. We'll get to that, but first, welcome to WBAI, Charlie Bagley.
Hey, thanks a lot, Tom.
Well, it's great
I'm happy to be in good company with Humphrey Bogart.
You sit right up right next to him. Listen, I know this is a crime story, but it also involves a very wealthy guy whose family is one of the city's leading real estate developers. Just briefly, tell us about the Durst family. Who are they?
Well, they're now in their 4th generation here, and they're probably the biggest real estate family in New York. They're very active in Manhattan. They're also now in Queens, which is new, Philadelphia, and Connecticut. And they're building both residential and commercial buildings. So it's an $8 billion empire.
$8 billion
And
empire. Okay.
Right. Count each dollar. And Bob was the oldest of the second generation leader, Seymour Durst, who is at least partly responsible for a lot of those big office towers on 6th Avenue, as well as elsewhere. But it's a big empire, and at least at one point, Bob was presumed to be the heir apparent.
Which is kind of extraordinary when you think about it, current events. So let's just try to tick off some of the history. I know we're never going to get through it all because it's so complex, and you've lived through almost every moment of it for the last 20 years. But I think it starts with Robert Durst's first wife, Kathy, who disappears in 1982. That's almost 40 years ago. But was he also acting pretty strange in the family business before then?
Well, yes. Bob's probably one of the key moments in his life occurred when he was 7 years old, and his mother either jumped or fell off the roof of the house. And, he blamed his father for it. Their relationship ran hot and cold for much of his life.
He blamed his father for his mother's death, for whatever happened to her. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that'll be pretty traumatizing for you.
Yes. So he used to beat up on his siblings, and being the oldest, and he was also, by his own admission, a lifelong liar. He grew up in Scarsdale, went to Scarsdale High School, went from there to Lehigh, and from Lehigh he took some graduate courses at UCLA, where he met Susan Berman, the woman that ended up dead in Los Angeles.
Right, that's a good friend. He just got convicted of killing. Okay.
Yeah, so Bob came after UCLA. In 1969, Bob came back to New York and worked at the office, but you could never count on him arriving on time. And he has said that, he didn't like coming in before noon. And, your typical work day, from 2 to 2:15, and then you take a break and go home.
And there was some other errant behavior on his part when he was still coming to the office, wasn't there?
He and his brother, Douglas, who runs the company now, he's the chairman, never liked one another, and from Douglas's narrative, he got beat up all the time by his older brother, and his happiest days was going to a different high school so that he didn't have to see his brother.
Right, but by the time they were working together at the business, wasn't there something about someone had a wrench on their desk or something? Or
a couple things about that. One was that Bob, he didn't like his brother so much that if his brother wasn't around, he used his brother's wastebasket as a urinal. And left it there as a kind of present for his brother. But he also kept some heavy tools on his desk. And they were big enough and pointed enough to that his brother had an iron pipe on his desk just in case.
Well, it's kind of an extraordinary scene, right? One of the biggest real estate companies, and the two brothers are worried one's going to pick up a wrench and slam him upside the head. All right. So you mentioned brother.
His father.
Go ahead.
His father didn't really, his father wanted to rehabilitate his relationship with Bob, and so he let a lot of things go.
Well, that was his eldest son, I guess, right? He was trying to save him.
The sort of biblical thing here is that the oldest son inherits.
So Douglas, he's the next under Bob in the family ranking? He's the second?
Yes. He's the second of 4 children.
I understand that he testified at this trial in Los Angeles over the summer, and that one of the things he said on the witness stand about his brother was, quote, he'd like to murder me. This is the kind of thing you might say half in jest at a family dinner party, but it was sworn testimony in front of a jury. Did the family, I mean, you said that Seymour tried to sort of rescue Robert. Did any of the other siblings, or was the feeling just get this guy the heck out of here?
Well, his youngest brother, Tom, also testified for the prosecution at the trial, and neither Douglas nor Tom had a good relationship at all with Bob, and they saw him as a pretty cruel and unhappy character. His sister Wendy tried to stay in touch with Bob even after he split from the family, and half the time nobody knew where he was, as he sort of wandered back and forth across the United States. At one point, he had a house in Connecticut, an apartment in Manhattan, a place in Dallas, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and in Northern California.
All right, so he wasn't hurting for money all this time, but at the same time...
Oh, no. Clearly, even, on his own, he was a multimillionaire. And when he was arrested in 2015, the police estimated his net worth at about $100 million.
$100 million.
How accurate that figure is, I'm not sure, but that was the estimate.
So then in 1982, after Bob, you're calling him Bob, by the way. I mean, why do you call him Bob? His name is Robert. Is he a buddy of yours, Charlie?
Well,
I'm just curious.
This is for a journalist, this is a really unusual case. It's not often that you spend 21 years.
That's true.
Writing about
and you get to know your subjects. Did you talked to him more than once, right?
Oh, yeah. And he waved to me in the courtroom, and...
you mean for this last trial, he waved at you?
Yes.
Okay, so he was fairly compos mentis. He was, all right. Okay.
Oh, yes. I mean, he's 78 years old, and he has a lot of medical problems that are evident just looking at him. But the brain is functioning. He's still very sharp. And he can tell a whopper at the drop of a hat. And it's got, his stories would have a lot of detail that makes it all the more believable or credible. It's just that he doesn't always remember the lie that he told the other person. So
that could be tricky.
A lot of his statements conflicted. But,
so am I, let me just break in for a second just to try to get this on some kind of chrono track. Thank you.
Sure.
This is WBAI FM 99.5 New York. The show's called Deadline NYC, and we're talking to Charles V. Bagley, the eminent journalist, former reporter for the New York Times and many other publications, who has been out on the West Coast the past few weeks reporting and covering the trial of Robert Durst, who was just convicted of murdering a woman who we'll hear more about in a moment. At some point, you and Kevin Flynn, another great investigative reporter at the Times, learned that Mr. Robert Durst is suspected of having snuffed his wife, Kathy, back in 1982. So I'm just curious, your beat was real estate and power in the city and urban maneuvering. How did it go down with the editors when you guys said, hey, we're going to do this story about a possible murderer? Were they into that?
Well, in the fall of 2000, we got a tip that they were reopening the investigation into the disappearance of Bob's wife.
And they, at this point, is the Westchester County District Attorney?
Well, the way it started is there was a young police investigator, a state police trooper, who had been chasing a weenie wagger all over Westchester County. And he finally...
I'm glad you put that so politely. Okay. Yeah. All right.
So he arrests the guy, and the guy says, you spent a lot of time chasing me down. Let me tell you a story. And I could go into the details, but like everything about this story, it goes on and on. But the long and the short of it is, the trooper got interested. So he dusted off the file from the state police, and then he got the larger file from the NYPD, and he started interviewing witnesses. Now, nothing that panned out at the Weenie Wagger.
Weenie Wagger he didn't catch.
But the trooper, Joe Becerra, got fascinated by the case and brought it to the Westchester DA.
And the case was what? I mean, Kathy Durst had been married to Robert Durst, and they didn't really have a very happy marriage at that point. Am I right?
Well, it was one of those classic stories where it starts out as a fairy tale marriage between this very wealthy, worldly guy, Bob Durst, and this young woman who had graduated high school and was working as a dental hygienist. She came from a lower middle class or even working class family, and it was love at first sight.
Okay.
And it was a very happy marriage for a couple of years, but Bob, he wants things the way he wants them. So at one point, Kathy is pregnant, and he forced her to get an abortion.
Uh-huh.
He said, "Look, you can have the kid, but then you're going to have a divorce."
Uh-huh.
And that sort of broke the trust in the relationship.
As well it might.
And so in the late 70s, you saw a kind of an escalating pattern of violence, both physical and emotional.
He was beating her up, wasn't he?
Yeah. I mean, he admitted to the producers of the Jinx that, the last couple of years of their marriage was just a lot of pushing, shoving, yelling, screaming, and then trips to the hospital.
And you don't go to the hospital for nothing. That means that there was some significant injuries. All right. So at some point, Kathy Durst disappears. Right. Let's just get to that point here.
The odd thing is, here it is. Her dream was to be a doctor. And she only had 4 months to graduation, and she suddenly vanishes. On January 31st, 1982, Bob says he puts her on a train in Katona, New York, a suburb of New York City, and she vanishes, never to be seen again. The family, Kathy's family, from the beginning is pointing the finger at Bob. Now,
because they knew about these violent incidents of his treatment of her?
Yes. In the end, Kathy told several people, if anything happens to me, don't let Bob get away with it.
Okay.
And she was clearly, in the last few months of her life, she was really scared.
Uh-huh.
And,
were they living together at that point?
Well, it was sort of on again, off again, because Kathy wanted a divorce, but she didn't want to leave the marriage empty-handed. And she said that, if she had just walked out on him, she was afraid that she'd be accused of abandonment at the divorce proceedings.
I see.
And she would lose out.
Uh-huh.
But it had really gotten to a terrible place. And then she vanishes. And the investigation ends up starting off in Manhattan at the 20th precinct, not in Westchester. And we could go into that investigation.
Well, let's not, because we got 2 more murders to deal with. Not that this one's a murder. I don't want to accuse him of something he hasn't been convicted of. But let's fast forward to the point when you get this assignment. You go to your editors, you and Kevin Flynn, another great reporter, and say, we're going to do this story. How did that play with the New York Times Metro desk?
Well, so the reason they put Kevin and I together is because Kevin had fabulous law enforcement sources, and I knew the Durst family, and I knew the real estate scene in New York very well.
Mm-hmm.
And we were able to put together a story pretty quickly. And even though I knew Seymour Durst, Bob's father, and I've known Douglas for more than 30 years, I had never really even heard Bob's name. So it was a little bit of a surprise. There's an older brother, and, he had split from the family 5 years earlier, and there's this new investigation.
The older brother who's now being suspected in a murder, okay, and a disappearance.
Right. So we put together what I thought was a pretty good story, but afterwards we thought, I'm not sure this story has legs.
This is about when? 2000? When does your story run? Your first story then?
November 11th, 2000.
2000, okay. You're not sure it has legs. That's a reporter's way of saying what, Charlie? You're not sure it has legs.
I don't think the story's going anywhere.
Okay.
We thought, look, they don't have any more evidence, in 2000 than they did in 1982. So what could happen?
And then something did happen.
Bob's friend.
What happened next?
When the news of this investigation hits the papers, Bob goes into a tizzy. He's scared. They're going to be after him. And so he marries a woman, a real estate broker in New York that he had once been a lover, but, they were not in a romantic relationship at that point. But he trusted her, and he wanted her to have control of his financial affairs. While he went to Galveston, Texas, he picked this backwater island in the Gulf, and he posed as a mute woman.
Wait a minute. $300 Time out. He went from New York to Galveston, Texas, and he posed as a woman who could not speak?
Correct.
Okay, right.
So what he did is he went as Bob Durst, although he didn't use that name, to the landlord, and he said, I'd like to rent a room in this house for my cousin. The alias he used was Dorothy Siner, who was a high school classmate of Bob's. And so he starts hanging out in Galveston because he's afraid that this crazy prosecutor back in Westchester, Janine Pirro, was going to come out.
Now, wait a minute. When you say crazy prosecutor, are you speaking from Robert Durst's perspective or your own? And either one is fair, but I'm just curious. What do you when you say crazy prosecutor, Charlie?
I think she totally mishandled this investigation and caused a lot of problems. If she saw it as a way to advance her political career, and at the time, the Pataki administration, Governor Pataki, was looking for her to run for the Senate or the Attorney General's office. And beating up on a billionaire, there's not really a downside to that.
Not a bad way to do it. But at least she didn't win AG and she didn't win the governorship or the senatorship, but she did get a show on Fox TV, right? So things paid off. So he's running from this crazy prosecutor, Janine Pirro, and I'll go with that on crazy. And he's hanging out as a mute woman in Galveston Bay, and then something happens with the neighbor across the hall that I've never understood. But the man ends up what? Will you tell us?
All right. Well, let me do it in historical order. So after
I think you could leave out some of the history, because there's a lot of history.
Yeah, no,
Charlie.
but there's another murder before that one. So we did our first story, and about a week later, I interviewed a friend of Bob's, and he told me, look, you got to talk to Susan Berman. She lives in Los Angeles. She was very close to Bob. She served as his spokesperson when the first wife disappeared. And I said, well, listen, I've been calling her. She doesn't answer the phone. I think if you called her and urged her to talk to me, we'd be in business. So he says, okay. So some time goes by, and on January 5th of 2001, I'm sitting in somebody's office waiting for them to show up for an interview, and I'm paging through the Daily News, and there at the bottom of the page is a 400-word article that Susan Berman, the woman I'd been trying to reach was found murdered over the Christmas holidays. And I literally jumped up out of my chair and I went, "Oh my God, I can't believe it." And I called the guy that was supposed to talk to her, and I said, "Nick, Susie's dead." And he said, "Oh my God, did you talk to her?" And I said, "You were supposed to set it up." And, so...
well, let me just ask you this, just in terms of the chronology, Charlie. Were you reaching her before Christmas? We think she died on Christmas Eve. Were you trying to reach her before then, or was that after she was already dead?
Yeah.
Okay, so she was, presumably she was ducking you then before somebody did her in. All right.
Susan had a very, very close bond with Bob. They were never lovers, but they were very close. And she knew Bob's secrets. She was also very loyal. Now, just to make the story a little more interesting, she was also the daughter of Davy the Jew Berman, who was a big wheel in Las Vegas. He ran the Flamingo Hotel, and he was a partner of Bugsy Siegel's. And then when the mob got tired of Bugsy Siegel and killed him, it was Davy the Jew Berman who walked into the Flamingo and said, "All right, everybody, I'm in charge."
Okay, all right. So that was Susie Berman's background. And I hadn't realized that. So Susan Berman is killed even before he does this other thing in Galveston, which we haven't told people about. But
Right.
She's killed at her home in a place called Benedict Canyon.
Right.
And isn't that where the Manson gang killed Sharon Tate and all those other people? I mean, it must be some crazy place.
Yes, right down the road is
Down
Yellow
the road.
Drive, where the Manson family went to work.
Oh my goodness.
Now, even closer to Susan's house is a house in which George Reeves died. George Reeves, as you might remember, played Superman.
Oh, now you're talking about pure tragedy, though. He was not killed. You can't kill Superman. He wasn't killed.
No,
He died by his own hand.
It was
didn't he?
ruled as suicide, but there were a lot of rumors, and there were some actors in Hollywood at the time who thought that he had been murdered.
Okay. All right. Well,
So,
who knows?
In the area, there is a lot of activity. I wouldn't. This is not a place where there's a lot of gangs, but there is a lot of murder.
Okay. Well, let's go back to after your story runs, and Mr. Durst has gone on the lam. He's someplace down in Texas, a place called Galveston, and then you find out that Susie Berman, the woman you were trying to talk to, has also been killed. And then what happens in Galveston?
So Bob is in and out of Galveston, but he's living there in this $300 a month room. This is a millionaire. He could afford to buy the island.
Okay. Well, he's acting very strangely. We know that. What happens with the guy next door?
So there's a guy across the hall from him in this rooming house, and by the name of Morris Black. And he's 10 or 15 years older than Bob. A cranky guy, but they get to be friendly. And they're palling around in Galveston. They go to the library together, and because you could get on the computer for free. And over the course of time, Morris Black learns Bob's real name, and Bob does away with the wig, and dressing like a woman, basically because he said he wasn't that good at it. When they would go to a bar and he'd try to light a cigarette and his wig would go on fire. The same kind of problems, Tom, that you would have if you were impersonating a woman.
Well, I've had that
and
problem.
hiding out in Galveston.
Okay, all right. And then they're no longer friendly.
Well, what happens is Bob decides it's time to pull out of Galveston. But Morris is hoping that Bob will buy a house in Galveston that they could both live on.
Uh-huh.
So, according to the prosecutor in Los Angeles, what was really going on is Bob is going to leave, but he's afraid that since Morris Black knows his real identity, that he could alert if he's mad enough, he might alert the authorities.
All right, well, that sounds like a motive to do something bad to Mr. Black. What happens to Mr. Black?
So, well, you want to know?
I want you to tell people what happened to Morris Black. Yes.
So, according to Bob, he comes back to his apartment one day, and Morris is sitting in his apartment, and Bob's worried. He said, they used to go shooting on Pelican Island, which is a tiny barren island off of Galveston. And anyway, he goes into his apartment, he sees Morris sitting at the kitchen table there, and he goes immediately to the oven. Now, why? Because a lot of people are now storing their guns in the oven. And he opens it, and oh my God, the gun's not there. He turns to Morris Black. Morris, where's the gun? Morris pulls it out from underneath the jacket, according to Bob. The two men struggle over this gun. They fall to the ground. The gun goes off and kills Morris Black. What does Bob do next? Well, he goes over to the Chez Louis, the most expensive hotel on the island, gets a haircut, has dinner, and thinks about it. He goes back the next day and says, well, nobody's going to believe me, so what's the best solution? I better go to the hardware store, get a bow saw, a paring knife, a bunch of thick plastic bags, and a drop cloth. I'm sure these are the
Wait a
same
minute.
things
Did you say paring knife, Charlie?
Yes.
Isn't that a sort of small knife? Isn't a paring knife a little thing?
Well, yeah, it's for the fine work.
Okay.
And what Bob did is he goes back to the apartment and he starts cutting up Morris Black's body.
Mm-hmm.
And so he severs the arms, the legs, and the head. And then he triple wraps each item and throws them in the back of his Honda and drives to the other side of the island, the north side of the island, and he finds a spot where he thinks, I'll throw them into the water, into the bay, and hopefully they'll drift into the shipping lane, never to be seen again. So I've been to this little pier, the little concrete stub of a pier, and he throws the bags in. When he comes back later, he sees that the bags, instead of drifting out to the channel, they are lapping up against the shoreline now.
I don't think he could have said that, but whatever he said.
Whatever he said. And he came back a third time, and he sees now that the police are there. And Bob ends up getting in his car and driving to New Orleans, where he had another $300 a month room. And
all right.
Now, what he also did is he brought with him a blanket.
Okay, wait a minute. We're gonna hold it. We're gonna stop it right there for a moment, where we can do this on radio, and we're gonna get a little bit of music for the moment. Stay with us, Charlie. Be back in a moment.
10 years ago, on a cold, dark night, there was someone killed neath the town hall light. There were few at the scene, but they all agreed that the slayer who ran looked a lot like me. The judge said, son, what is your alibi? If you were somewhere else, then you won't have to die. I spoke not a word, though it meant my life, for I had been in the arms of my best friend's wife.
Lefty Frizzell. The original Long Black Veil from 1959, it doesn't quite work for this episode here of Deadline NYC, but it gives you the flavor. Since the fellow in this song was hung for a murder he didn't commit, but it gives you the flavor. Charlie, has anybody written the Ballad of Robert Durst?
Not yet.
Would you do the lyrics? Would you be interested in doing the lyrics? Because that could be a good song.
Yeah, I'd take a shot at them.
Okay. All right. So we got another murder to get to yet, but I release what happens in the Berman murder on the West Coast. But an amazing thing happens in court, to me at least, as an observer from afar. You were there, weren't you, when he went on trial?
Yes, I was there for the whole trial.
And
the trial had actually begun in 2020. We got through jury selection.
No, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the one in Galveston. I'm talking about the Galveston trial.
Okay. So Galveston. So Bob hires a hugely expensive team of lawyers. You know, they were like gunslingers out of Houston.
Well, that's what I would do too if I was, being charged with dismembering somebody for no reason. Okay.
Sure. Well, what he was charged with was killing Morris Black, and that what the defense hammered away at, and first of all, you have to understand that the lawyers he hired were like the top lawyers in the Southwest. These are the go-to people if you're charged with murder. Dick DeGuerin, Mike Ramsey, and Chip Lewis. And they ran circles around the prosecution. The prosecution thought that, God, we've got all this evidence. When they recovered the body parts, by the way, the head is still missing, but when they recovered the body parts, there was all kinds of evidence that led them back to this house on Avenue K that Bob and Morris Black lived in. And there was evidence that somebody had been wiping up the blood, both in the apartments and in the hallway. And then they found the weapon. And, it was just a ton of evidence. So they needn't worry about motive. But they left a void, and the defense jumped into that void with 2 feet, and they said, look, this guy, Morris Black, was a very, very cantankerous. He was so cantankerous, he was your worst nightmare.
He's the guy you might want to dismember. Okay, so I need to get to the end of this one because we're going to want to take you back to L.A. where you spent all summer. But,
okay.
But you once had a conversation with Robert Durst, Charlie, about him dismembering the body of Morris Black. Am I right about that? You once actually talked to him about it.
Yes,
this is an interview that most reporters have not had.
Yeah.
And you asked him about the head, and what did he tell you?
Well, this is the big mystery, is why look, he threw them into water that was a couple inches deep. They were never going to float out into the shipping channel.
Is that what he told you? What did he tell you about the head?
Well, he said, look, I don't know where the head is. I dragged them, all these body parts, down to the pier, and they were so heavy, I dropped them in the water. I've got no idea where they are.
All right. Well, that's quite a conversation to have. All right, but he gets convicted. He does some jail time around this, but then he gets out. And in between, I want to cut up to the Jinx, because the Jinx is done. He agrees to participate in this movie with Andrew Jarecki, and in the course of the movie, he says some stuff which a lot of people heard. It became a cause sensation, and during the time he's being asked about events involving Susie Berman, the woman you were trying to talk to, who was killed in her home in Benedict Canyon. And what is that thing that he was heard to say in the Jinx?
Well, he did 2 series of interviews with the guys from the Jinx. The first time was over 3 days in California in 2010. And then they thought they wanted to do one more big roundup. And this was at the Regency in New York in 2012. And they, at the end of the interview, Bob got up and he said, you got a bathroom here. And he walked into the bathroom, and before he even closed the doors, he said something to the effect of, there it is, you're caught. And what everyone heard at the conclusion of the Jinx in 2015 was two other sentences. They were not consecutive sentences, but it sure sounded like it. And that was, killed them all, of course.
Killed them all, of
shocking
course. Killed them.
Yeah.
And this was after he had been confronted with an envelope that matched his handwriting and which had a misspelling on it that matched his own misspelling. And that's when he gets up and goes to the bathroom.
Correct.
And almost immediately after this airs, it's almost like the cops are waiting for the final moments of the show, right? They just pounce.
Well, what happened was, I was talking to Bob after every episode. It was every Sunday night. They'd play an episode, one of 6 episodes of the Jinx, and I'd ask him what he thought. So after the 3rd episode, Bob thought he was in pretty good shape. He said, well, look, they've gone out, they described Kathy, they did Morris Black, they did Susan Berman. I don't know how much more they can talk. But when I spoke to him after the 5th episode, which is where they first confront him with those 2 envelopes, and now that is a one tiny scrap of evidence of new evidence that was discovered by the filmmakers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's what had gotten LA interested. And they first started talking to prosecutors in Los Angeles in 2013. So 2 years before the airing of the Jinx. So after the 5th episode, the FBI at this time is tracking Bob's whereabouts. And so they're pinging his phone, and they see that he gets into a car and he starts driving east from Houston. When he turns off the phone and it goes off the map, and they don't know where he's going. So at that point, LA figured that he was going to run and he might leave the country. So they went to court and got a murder warrant for Bob. But they still don't know where he is. Now, I'll tell you one thing, that I got a call Friday night, and someone told me Bob's in New Orleans at the JW Marriott, and they told me the alias that he was using at the hotel. And, I was shocked, and I thought, oh my gosh.
Did you call him?
I did not call him at that point. And so that was a Friday night, and the final episode was going to be broadcast on Sunday at 8 o'clock. And what happens is the FBI goes, Bob turns his phone back on. This was his big mistake, and calls for his messages. And, it lights up the FBI, and they send 2 agents to the JW Marriott Hotel on Canal. And they go to the desk and they said, do you have a Bob Durst registered? No. So one by one, they go through 10 aliases. Do you have Dorothy Steiner? Do you have Jim Terse?
Okay.
One name after another.
Okay.
No. So the 2 agents look at each other. What are we going to do now? But who comes waltzing through the revolving door? None other than Bob Durst. So he walks by one of the FBI agents, and the agent says to him, Mr. Durst, and he doesn't quite, turn around, but they think they've got their guy, so they ask him to sit down, and they talk to him.
Okay.
And while they're talking to him in the library, a woman walks by and says, oh, is that Bob Durst? Because she's been watching the Jinx. You can't make this stuff
You
up.
can't make this stuff up. Hold on, you couldn't make this stuff up either on WBAI 99.5 FM, where we're listening to Charles Bagley, ace reporter from the New York Times, talk about his 20-year trek pursuing Robert Durst, the millionaire murderer. So Charlie, I'm curious about, let's talk about the LA case, all right? I mean, because I know that you were there, I know you covered the trial, but I'm not clear as to how they actually convicted him. Was there any physical evidence that linked him to Susan Berman's murder? Do they have a weapon? Did he leave any DNA or fingerprints or anything like that?
There were, Bob's fingerprints were not inside Susan Berman's home. They never found the weapon that killed her. And for 20 years, actually 19 years, Bob denied that he was even in L.A.
Were they able to prove that he was there?
Well, what happened is that there was a lot of pretrial argument over whether it was Bob's handwriting on the so-called cadaver note.
And I'm sorry,
Yeah,
let's just tell people, it's called a cadaver note because the note actually said there's a cadaver in this address in Benedict Canyon, right? That's
correct.
Okay.
All right. Just the only word on the sheet of paper, it just said cadaver and the address. That's
okay.
it. Although it's misspelled Beverly.
Right, and that was the link.
On the front.
But is there anything else, Charlie? Is there anything else that they were able to prove that he?
So what happened is he just on the eve of the trial, they admit that not only was he in L.A., but he found Susan's body, and that he wrote the cadaver note. Now, this is a note that he said only the killer could have written in a prior interview. Now, the second very important piece of evidence for this case was he had a dinner with an old friend by the name of Nick Chavin in December of 2014. Nick Chavin is the guy who first told me I got to find Susan Berman. I got to talk to Susan Berman.
Okay.
And he and I have gotten to really know each other.
What's the dinner? How does the dinner tie into the conviction?
So Nick called me in December and he said, "Hey, I reunited with Bob. He gave me the key to his townhouse. Bob had bought a townhouse in Harlem. He had a hard time buying an apartment in New York. A lot of the co-op board didn't want a shady character in their building. So he had bought a building on 121st Street in Harlem. And so anyway, Nick reunites. Then he calls me a couple days later and he says, Bob wants to talk about Susie and Kathy. And we're supposed to have dinner in the restaurant in the basement of Grand Central Terminal.
The Oyster Bar.
The Oyster Bar, correct. And then Nick calls me and tells me, well, look, Bob, he had to postpone it for a day or a short time. And so then they changed the location of the dinner. And then after the dinner, Nick wouldn't talk about what happened.
Okay. Did Nick? I'm sorry, but we got about 5 minutes left, a little less. So how does the dinner connect to his conviction?
Bob wanted to have this dinner. He invites his longtime friend, and the subject doesn't come up during dinner. So as they're outside the restaurant about to part, Nick Chavin says to Bob Durst, "Hey, you wanted to talk about Susan." And Bob said, "I had to. I had no choice. It was her or me." And Nick is shocked.
I see. And this, I'm sorry, and this testimony by Chavin is made at the trial in L.A.?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So are those the two things they have, the letter and Nick Chavin's testimony? Are those the two key elements?
Well, they also disproved Bob's stories, his account of what he did when he was in California.
Okay, he'd made up stories, but he'd been making up stories his entire life. But I'm just curious. His alleged motive for wanting to kill his good friend Susie Berman was supposedly she knew too much about him too. But he's never been even indicted for the murder of his wife. I don't understand how they won a conviction. And isn't this going to be overturned? Isn't this almost inevitably going to be?
No.
I mean, it's already been appealed, right?
Well, they haven't filed the appeal. They filed for a new trial. I think they know that's not going to work, and then they'll apply. They'll go to appellate court. I think it's highly doubtful. The prosecutor in Los Angeles is probably the best cold case prosecutor in the country. He's got a winning record.
Well, that may be. He may be, the Perry Mason of prosecutors. But it seems to me that, he managed to get a jury to convict someone of a murder of which there was very little evidence. Are you convinced that Bob Durst committed this murder?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it was more than that, because even though he was only charged with murder, with one murder in Los Angeles, the theory of the case was that everything that happened, the other two murders, Kathy Durst and Morris Black, were all related.
No, I understand that's the theory, but as I say, he's never been even indicted for his wife's murder.
What he said, what the prosecutor said at the beginning of the trial in his opening statement, was that he was going to prove that Bob killed all three people. Not only was there no body with respect to Kathy,
right,
but he had been acquitted of killing Morris Black.
Right, so we know he killed him.
Time afterwards,
right.
on related charges.
Okay.
But he was acquitted of the murder.
Okay, well, we only got a couple minutes left here, so let's just catch up. Is there any chance that the current district attorney, is her name Miriam Rocha?
Yeah.
That's in Westchester County. Is she going to try to indict him now for the murder of his wife? Is there any new evidence on which she could do that?
Well, many people expect her to indict Bob next month.
On what new evidence? Just because he's been convicted in L.A. of killing someone else? I hate to sound like Mr. Durst defender, but I just, sounds to me like this is a little.
Because at this point, the only thing that Bob can be charged with is intentional murder, murder one, because all the other charges have gone away, because of the expiration. They can't charge.
I see. There's a statute of limitations on other counts, but not on intentional murder. Okay.
Correct. So I don't know exactly how they're going to do that.
But you think they're going to do it? You expect it to happen? Now, he's, 78 years old?
Yes.
And he is in pretty frail health, it looks like, at least from the pictures.
Oh, he's definitely, if you thought that the O.J. chase down the highway was a slow chase, chasing Bob right now would be...
Is he remanded? He's in custody now, right?
He's been in custody since 2015.
Okay, so is he going to? When is he due to be sentenced?
He's in a hospital ward. He is in a hospital ward, but there were, even though the defense brought in a doctor from California that they hired, who said that, you put Bob on the stand, he's going to die. He's in such bad health, he can't assist in his own defense.
It's a sad picture. We gotta leave it there. Charles V. Bagley, Ace reporter. That was an incredible saga. Thank you so much for sharing all the highlights and the lowlights from this chase of Robert Durst.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So we'll let Eddie Lockjaw Davis steal the last few moments of this show. Thanks, everyone. Take care.